Have you ever stopped to think that many of our impulsive and emotional reactions might reflect animalistic behaviors? When faced with a threat or provocation, how do we react? Do we hide? Do we flee? Or, like a goose, do we shout and attack at the slightest sign of danger? Human behavior, seemingly so complex and rational, has deep roots in our primitive instincts. By observing the goose and its way of navigating the world, we begin to understand more about ourselves than we might have imagined. How can we learn to master these impulsive reactions and make our responses more balanced? In the upcoming chapters, we will delve into this phenomenon, exploring how animal reactions shape our emotions and actions. Emotions are at the core of human existence, influencing our thoughts, actions, and relationships in ways we often don't fully understand. They shape how we respond to the world around us, how we interact with others, and how we perceive ourselves. While emotions such as joy, love, and sadness are commonly discussed, one emotion that often takes center stage, especially in moments of conflict or threat, is fear. This emotion, powerful, visceral, and deeply ingrained in our psychology, can trigger reactions that are primal and instinctive. But what happens when we examine these emotional states through the lens of the animal world? Fear is an essential survival mechanism. It's the body's way of alerting us to danger, preparing us to fight or flee. This survival instinct is rooted deep within us, a remnant of our evolutionary ancestors who faced physical threats on a daily basis. When faced with a threat, whether real or perceived, our body enters a state of heightened alert. The heart rate spikes, muscles tense, and our senses become sharpened. These responses are not just abstract processes, they are biological, designed to ensure our survival. This system, called the fight-or-flight response, is incredibly effective when dealing with immediate, physical threats. However, in the modern world, the threats we face are often not physical in nature. The dangers are often psychological or social: fear of rejection, fear of failure, or fear of confrontation. Despite this shift in the type of threat, our body still reacts in the same way, as though we are facing a life-or-death situation. Consider a stressful situation such as a job interview or a difficult conversation with a loved one. The physiological symptoms of fear, such as a racing heart and sweaty palms, are not dissimilar to the responses we'd experience if we were suddenly faced with a wild animal in the wild. These feelings are uncomfortable, but they are also a reflection of a biological system designed to protect us. Take, for example, the experience of confrontation. Imagine yourself in a tense meeting at work, where someone challenges your ideas or questions your competence. The instinctive reaction for many people would be to become defensive, perhaps even combative. This is a deeply ingrained survival mechanism, a form of emotional self-defense. We may not physically fight back, but we fight with our words, our posture, and our attitudes. This is not dissimilar to the behavior of an animal threatened by an intruder. When a goose feels its territory is at risk, it will puff itself up, honk loudly, and take aggressive action. It is, in essence, trying to ward off a perceived danger. This emotional state of defensiveness, then, is not a purely human reaction. It is one that exists in all of us, rooted in our shared evolutionary history. Fear and defensiveness are reactions that all animals experience when their territory or well-being is threatened, and they manifest in humans in ways that can sometimes seem out of proportion to the situation at hand. Why does this happen? Why does fear cause such an intense, often aggressive response? And why, in moments of fear, do we sometimes react in ways that seem disproportionate or irrational? To understand this, it is helpful to think of fear as a signal, one that calls our attention to something that could harm us. But unlike the physical threats of our evolutionary past, the emotional and social threats we face today don't always require such an extreme reaction. Still, the body doesn't differentiate between physical and emotional stress. The hormonal responses are the same. And when those responses are triggered, they can result in behaviors that we may later regret, such as snapping at a colleague, withdrawing from a loved one, or becoming defensive in a conversation that isn't really a threat. Fear, in this sense, is like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it protects us, keeping us alert and safe. On the other, it can cause us to react in ways that are not always helpful or constructive. It can cause us to shut down emotionally, avoid difficult conversations, or push people away when we feel threatened. Over time, these reactions can build walls around us, making it harder to engage with others or to approach life with the openness and flexibility we need to grow. In examining the role of fear in our lives, we must also consider how it influences our relationships. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, and fear of failure are some of the most common emotional challenges that individuals face. These fears are often internalized, affecting our self-worth and how we interact with others. When we are afraid of being judged, we may become defensive, quick to shut down or criticize others before they have a chance to criticize us. In relationships, this can manifest as arguments, misunderstandings, and a lack of emotional vulnerability. We may feel compelled to protect ourselves at all costs, even if it means pushing others away. Yet, fear does not always have to lead to negative outcomes. It is possible to learn to recognize when fear is influencing our actions and to make a conscious choice to react differently. Awareness of our emotional responses allows us to pause, reflect, and choose a response that is more aligned with our values and goals. This is where emotional intelligence comes in. Understanding our emotions, acknowledging them, and learning to navigate them effectively. It's about becoming aware of when fear is dictating our reactions and finding ways to manage it in a healthier way. This brings us to an interesting idea, that perhaps, by understanding the animal behaviors that mirror our own emotional states, we can gain insights into how to manage our fears more effectively. In the next chapter, we will explore the behavior of the goose, an animal whose instinctive reactions to fear closely mirror our own. By understanding how the goose responds to threats, we can begin to see how our own emotional reactions are influenced by these same survival instincts. Through this exploration, we will not only gain insight into animal behavior but also into the depths of our own emotional states. By the end of this chapter, we have explored the profound connection between human fear and the primal instincts that govern it. While fear serves a protective purpose, it can also lead to irrational and defensive behaviors that hinder our growth. By becoming more aware of these emotional states and their impact on our relationships and self-perception, we can begin to shift how we respond to the challenges we face in life. The next chapter will take us one step closer to understanding how the behaviors of animals like the goose can provide valuable lessons for navigating our emotional landscapes. When we think of animals reacting to threats, one of the most obvious and powerful examples is the goose. Known for its loud, aggressive honks and defensive behaviors, the goose is an animal that, when threatened, doesn't hesitate to fight back. Much like human beings, its instinctual response to a perceived threat is a fight-or-flight reaction. However, unlike many other animals, geese tend to fall squarely on the fight side of the equation. The goose's reaction is loud, intense, and often dramatic, an immediate response to ensure its safety. A goose's territory is incredibly important to it, and it will fiercely defend it when it perceives any intruder. Whether it's protecting a nest or its space, a goose will not think twice before confronting a perceived threat. If it feels its territory is at risk, it will charge, honking loudly, flapping its wings, and even attempting to physically push the threat away. This behavior is not simply a reaction, it's a primal survival instinct deeply embedded in the animal's DNA. For a goose, the concept of personal space and security is sacred, and any intrusion is met with swift and decisive action. What makes the goose's behavior particularly interesting is its tendency to escalate situations with intensity and noise. It is not subtle in its approach, it announces its presence with a loud honk, a powerful display that warns the intruder of the danger it poses. This loud display serves two purposes. It serves as a warning to the intruder and a way to rally other geese to join in the defense. Geese are highly social animals, and when one goose responds to a threat, others often follow suit, creating a formidable defense. This collective response helps ensure the survival of the group, as they work together to fend off potential dangers. This aggressive response is not limited to just physical confrontations. The goose's emotional response to a perceived threat is just as intense. Geese do not back down easily, they are committed to defending themselves and their territory at all costs. In a way, their honking and flapping are expressions of fear and anger combined. They act out of an instinctual need to protect themselves from the unknown, and their behavior, while loud and confrontational, is ultimately a survival strategy. But why is this relevant to understanding human behavior? Humans, much like geese, also have deeply ingrained emotional responses to perceived threats. These threats can come in many forms, whether physical, emotional, or social, and our responses, though more complex, often mirror those of animals. For example, when we feel threatened or criticized, we may react defensively, just as a goose would. We may raise our voices, become angry, or retreat into our territory, our personal space, whether physical or emotional, attempting to protect ourselves from further harm. Like the goose, we sometimes feel the need to confront the threat head-on, especially when our sense of self or security is at risk. The goose's response to a threat is a prime example of the instinctive nature of animal behavior. When faced with danger, the goose does not waste time considering the nuances of the situation, it acts. There is no overthinking or second-guessing, only immediate, decisive action. This is the essence of the fight-or-flight response in its most basic form. However, the goose does not simply act out of instinct, it also uses its social structure to amplify its defense. By creating a loud, collective response, the goose ensures that it is not alone in facing the threat, and it increases the chances of survival for the entire flock. In many ways, humans share this same tendency. When faced with emotional or social threats, whether it's a heated argument, criticism, or any situation that challenges our sense of security, we often react with the same intensity as the goose. The fight-or-flight response kicks in, and we may either lash out at the perceived threat, fight, or retreat into ourselves, becoming defensive or avoiding confrontation, flight. These responses are primal, hardwired into us, and they often occur without conscious thought. Just like the goose, we act before we think, driven by our innate desire to protect ourselves. But what sets us apart from the goose is our capacity for reflection and choice. While a goose cannot pause and consider a situation before reacting, humans have the ability to step back and analyze their emotional responses. We have the potential to learn from our instincts, to understand why we react the way we do, and to consciously choose a different response when we are faced with emotional threats. In the same way that a goose might eventually realize that its loud honking is ineffective against certain threats, we, too, can learn that our instinctual reactions might not always serve us in the best way. Understanding the goose's behavior can provide us with valuable insights into our own responses to fear and threats. Just as the goose is driven by the need to protect itself and its territory, humans are driven by similar emotional needs. Our fear responses may not always be as loud or dramatic, but they are just as real. By studying the goose's response to danger, we can begin to understand the root of our own emotional reactions and learn to navigate them with greater awareness and control. This chapter has shown us how the goose's instinctual response to threats parallels human behavior, particularly when it comes to defending our personal space and security. The intense, often loud reaction of the goose to perceived danger is not unlike the emotional defensiveness humans experience when faced with criticism, confrontation, or emotional turmoil. In the next chapter, we will dive deeper into how these behaviors are connected to our emotional states and how understanding the goose's response can help us better understand our own. By making these connections, we can gain a greater understanding of how our emotions shape our actions and how we can begin to manage them more effectively. At first glance, the behaviors of a goose and those of a human may seem worlds apart. However, when we dive deeper into the psychology behind both species, we begin to see striking similarities. Just as the goose reacts instinctively to defend its territory, humans too exhibit defensive behaviors when they perceive threats, whether those threats are physical, emotional, or social. The key to understanding this parallel lies in our shared need for safety, security, and self-preservation. The actions of the goose and human beings are driven by the same fundamental instincts. Let's take a closer look at how these instincts manifest. When a goose perceives danger, it honks loudly and aggressively, sometimes charging at the perceived threat with flapping wings and an open beak. This immediate, forceful reaction is designed to scare off intruders and protect its nest or territory. The goose doesn't waste time contemplating the situation. It reacts based on instinct, operating on a primal level of fear and aggression that is hardwired into its nature. Similarly, when humans feel threatened, whether by a verbal confrontation, criticism, or emotional provocation, we often respond in a similar way. Consider how we might react when we feel attacked. A person might raise their voice, shout, or even use sharp, biting words to defend themselves. We act quickly to protect our emotional boundaries, just as the goose acts to defend its physical space. This immediate, sometimes loud, reaction is a natural defense mechanism that kicks in as soon as we sense danger. In both cases, the intensity of the response is a reflection of the perceived severity of the threat. Just as a goose will not hesitate to defend its territory against even the smallest of threats, humans too may react harshly in situations where we feel our emotional safety is at risk. The goose's behavior also reveals something about the concept of territory and personal space. For a goose, this is an instinctual need. The goose's territory is its sanctuary, a place of safety, where it can rest, nest, and rear its young. When this space is threatened, the goose reacts with a deep, primal urgency. For humans, our personal space is equally significant, although it may take different forms. Our territory could be our home, our sense of self, or our emotional boundaries. When these are violated, whether by an intruder in our physical space or by an emotional attack from a loved one or colleague, we instinctively react. Just as the goose feels an overwhelming need to protect its territory, we feel a need to defend our emotional space. One important aspect of the goose's response is its use of sound as a means of communication. A loud honk serves not only as a warning to the intruder but also as a call for backup. Other geese, hearing the distress call, may rush to the aid of the threatened individual. This collective response strengthens the defensive position of the group. In human terms, this is akin to the ways we call out for support when we feel threatened. Whether we turn to a friend, partner, or even a social group, our need for reinforcement in moments of distress is a deeply ingrained part of our emotional makeup. The goose's behavior in this regard mirrors the human tendency to seek solidarity when facing challenges. Moreover, this need for support and solidarity is not limited to physical protection. Emotional threats, such as a personal attack or harsh criticism, often prompt us to seek validation or comfort from those who understand us. We are social creatures, and much like the goose relies on its flock for security, we rely on the people around us for emotional support when dealing with stress or perceived danger. Just as the goose rallies other geese to strengthen its defense, we turn to our social networks to fortify ourselves against emotional or psychological harm. This is where the real power of the goose-human connection lies. Both the goose and the human being possess an innate need for protection, whether physical or emotional, and both instinctively respond to threats with intensity. However, the goose does not have the capacity to reflect on its actions after it has honked or charged. It does not second-guess whether its reaction was justified. On the other hand, humans are capable of reflecting on our emotional responses. We have the ability to pause and reconsider our actions before, during, and after a confrontation. This capacity for reflection allows us to adjust our responses in a way that can mitigate the potential harm caused by an overly defensive or aggressive reaction. For instance, while a goose may continue to aggressively defend its territory long after the perceived threat has left, a human being has the ability to analyze the situation, step back, and choose a different course of action. Perhaps we decide that the confrontation isn't worth escalating further, or we recognize that the threat was not as dangerous as it initially seemed. This awareness gives us a distinct advantage over the goose in our ability to manage and navigate emotional threats with more control and sophistication. That said, the goose's instinctive response to threats provides an important lesson for us as humans. Sometimes, reacting immediately to a threat is necessary. When we feel our emotional safety is at risk, our initial instinct might be to react defensively, just as the goose would. However, the key to emotional maturity lies in our ability to pause, assess the situation, and then respond thoughtfully. In this way, understanding the goose's behavior can be a reminder of the importance of self-awareness and the need for emotional regulation. Additionally, the goose's behavior reinforces the idea of self-preservation, both physical and emotional. When a goose feels threatened, it will not hesitate to defend itself, as its instinct is to survive. Similarly, we, too, have an inherent desire to protect ourselves, our well-being, our self-image, and our emotional stability. In recognizing this, we can better understand our defensive behaviors and work towards understanding when they are warranted and when they may be overblown. In this chapter, we've explored how the goose's reaction to perceived threats mirrors human behavior, especially in the realm of emotional defense and personal space. By drawing this parallel, we see that while our responses may differ in complexity, they are deeply rooted in the same basic instinct, the need to protect ourselves. The next chapter will delve into the scientific explanation behind these behaviors, helping to connect the dots between the biological and emotional aspects of both the goose's instincts and our own. Through this understanding, we can gain deeper insight into the emotional triggers that drive our reactions and how we can better manage them in our daily lives. To fully understand the behavioral patterns we've observed in both the goose and humans, it is crucial to dive into the science behind our reactions to perceived threats. This chapter will explore both psychological and biological aspects, offering an explanation of why we and the goose react so similarly in these situations. We will look at the science of instincts, emotions, and defense mechanisms, bridging the gap between animal behavior and human responses. At the core of both the goose's and humans' defensive behaviors lies a primal part of the brain, the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for processing emotions, particularly fear, and triggering our fight-or-flight response when we feel threatened. This response, which is immediate and automatic, ensures survival by preparing the body to either confront the danger or flee from it. The goose, with its highly developed survival instincts, depends on this same primitive brain function when it perceives danger. The goose's honk and aggressive behavior are direct results of this instinctive response. In humans, the amygdala plays a similar role. However, the human brain is more complex than that of the goose. While our instinctive response may be similar, reacting to threats with an outburst of anger or defensiveness. We also possess a prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, decision-making, and self-control. This higher brain function allows us to reflect on a situation and potentially alter our reactions. For example, while we might initially feel the rush of anger or frustration in response to a verbal attack, the prefrontal cortex enables us to take a step back, assess the situation, and decide whether to respond aggressively, retreat, or engage in a calm discussion. This capacity for reflection is something the goose lacks, and it provides humans with a unique advantage in managing emotional reactions. However, the goose's instincts are honed by millennia of evolution to prioritize immediate survival. The idea of a territorial instinct that we observe in geese is supported by studies in ethology, the science of animal behavior. Research shows that animals, like geese, have an innate drive to protect their territory, which they rely on for nesting, feeding, and rearing offspring. This territorial behavior is an essential part of their evolutionary success. When a goose's territory is threatened, the resulting defensive behavior, honking, charging, and aggressive displays, is not only natural but necessary for its survival. Humans also have territorial instincts, but the concept of territory is not limited to physical space. Our emotional territories are just as vital to our survival. Psychologically, humans have boundaries that are critical for maintaining mental and emotional well-being. These emotional boundaries serve as a form of psychological protection against stress, anxiety, and emotional harm. Just like the goose's need to protect its physical space, we instinctively defend our emotional territory when it is encroached upon, whether by a harsh comment, an invasion of privacy, or an emotional betrayal. This drive for emotional protection is rooted in the same evolutionary need for survival. In fact, psychologists often refer to this as the self-preservation instinct. From a biological standpoint, self-preservation is one of the most fundamental drives that shapes behavior. Whether it's physical survival or emotional stability, our brain reacts in ways designed to ensure our continued well-being. When a threat arises, whether physical or emotional, the brain activates a variety of neural pathways to alert us to danger, prepare us to act, and heighten our awareness of potential harm. Interestingly, the concept of fight or flight responses in both geese and humans is a product of the sympathetic nervous system. This system prepares the body to take action by increasing heart rate, dilating pupils, and redirecting blood flow to essential organs, such as the muscles, for a quick reaction. The goose's loud honk and aggressive charge can be understood as the physiological manifestation of its fight-or-flight response. For humans, this might translate into raising one's voice, becoming physically tense, or feeling the urge to stand one's ground in the face of conflict. The brain's activation of the sympathetic nervous system serves to prepare both the goose and the human to deal with an imminent threat. While these behaviors are crucial in immediate situations of danger, it is important to recognize that these responses are often triggered by perceived threats rather than real ones. This is especially true for humans, who can experience emotional fight or flight responses in situations where no physical harm is present. For instance, a minor disagreement at work can trigger a disproportionate emotional reaction, such as becoming overly defensive or aggressive, because the brain interprets the situation as a threat to our well-being, even though there is no real physical danger. This overreaction can be linked to the same primal instinct found in animals like geese, but in humans, it is often influenced by past experiences, personal insecurities, or unresolved emotional wounds. From a psychological perspective, this reaction can be explained by the concept of emotional dysregulation, which refers to the inability to manage emotional responses appropriately. When a person's emotional boundaries are threatened, their fight-or-flight response may be triggered more intensely than the situation warrants. This often leads to overreactions or defensive behaviors that are not necessarily aligned with the actual threat at hand. The more a person struggles to regulate their emotional reactions, the more likely they are to engage in aggressive, defensive, or avoidant behaviors, much like the goose who instinctively overreacts to a threat, even if the danger has passed. Furthermore, studies in neurobiology have shown that our emotional responses are not always rational. When we are emotionally triggered, our brain bypasses our higher cognitive functions, like reasoning, and activates our emotional centers instead. This explains why we might act impulsively or react strongly in situations where our emotional boundaries are violated. This is particularly relevant when examining how both geese and humans defend their personal territory. For the goose, the instinct to protect its territory is straightforward, biologically necessary, and unfiltered by logic. In humans, while the response is similarly instinctual, it can be tempered or heightened depending on our emotional regulation abilities and past experiences. In this chapter, we've seen how the biological processes behind human and goose defensive behaviors are fundamentally similar. Both species share a survival mechanism rooted in the activation of the fight-or-flight response, triggered by a perceived threat to their physical or emotional well-being. While geese react instinctively and without reflection, humans have the advantage of higher cognitive processes that allow for emotional regulation and self-reflection. However, like the goose, humans must also manage their primal reactions to ensure they respond appropriately to threats, rather than overreacting due to emotional triggers. In the next chapter, we'll look at real-world examples that illustrate these behavioral patterns, both in geese and humans, to understand how these responses play out in everyday life. Example 1. The office confrontation. Imagine a typical office scenario. A colleague at work, who you've had a difficult history with, suddenly challenges you in a meeting. They question your decision on a recent project, undermining your professional competence in front of the entire team. Instantly, your body reacts, your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, and your mind races. Much like a goose honking and charging at an intruder in its territory, you feel the overwhelming urge to defend yourself and protect your position. In that moment, your brain triggers a fight-or-flight response. Your emotional boundary has been crossed, and you're now defending your territory, in this case, your professional reputation. But instead of calmly considering a measured response, your emotions take over. You raise your voice, perhaps even shout, in an attempt to regain control and assert your dominance in the situation. You've become like the goose, instinctively reacting to the perceived threat, without stopping to assess whether such an aggressive response is truly necessary. This scenario mirrors the behavior of the goose who, when its territory is threatened, charges without hesitation. While the goose does this to protect its survival, the human reaction, although influenced by similar primal instincts, may also be rooted in fear of judgment, loss of status, or perceived injustice. The overreaction, though often unconscious, has the same basis: the instinctive need to protect what is ours, whether that is our reputation, our emotional space, or our physical environment. Example 2. The family argument. In another example, think about a family dinner where an unresolved issue arises, perhaps an argument about finances, a past decision, or an old family feud. A normally calm family member suddenly explodes in anger, snapping at others in the room. Their emotional boundary has been pushed, and, much like a goose honking loudly to defend its territory, they react aggressively to regain control of the situation. This escalation in anger is often fueled by long-standing emotional triggers. Just as the goose might perceive an intruder as an existential threat, the family member perceives a challenge to their personal space and emotional well-being. Whether the threat is real or imagined, the brain activates the fight-or-flight response, which leads to defensive and often disproportionate reactions. The outburst serves as an emotional shield, a way to push away what is perceived as a danger to their emotional territory. For instance, the family member might start blaming others, raising their voice, or even shutting down communication entirely in order to regain control over the conversation. They may not even be aware that their response is linked to deep-seated emotional triggers or past experiences. In this case, just as the goose would react to a perceived threat to its territory, the family member instinctively defends their emotional space, even if it leads to further conflict. Example 3. The online dispute. In today's world, much of our territory is no longer just physical or emotional, it extends into the digital space. Social media platforms, where opinions and personalities clash regularly, are ripe environments for defensive, territorial reactions. A heated debate on a social media post can quickly escalate into a personal attack, with individuals defending their beliefs as if their very survival depends on it. Consider a situation where someone posts an opinion online, and a stranger disagrees with them in a rude or inflammatory way. Instantly, the initial poster feels their territory, whether that's their beliefs, their self-esteem, or their reputation, under attack. Much like the goose, they are triggered into a fight-or-flight response, where the instinct to protect their territory takes over. Instead of calmly addressing the disagreement, they may lash out, engaging in name-calling, insults, or even personal attacks in an attempt to protect their space. In this case, the territorial defense becomes an online battle, where words replace physical confrontations. However, the emotional intensity remains the same. Just like the goose protecting its nest, people often react defensively to preserve their identity, beliefs, or status. This behavior is instinctual, triggered by the feeling of vulnerability when personal boundaries are crossed, even in the virtual world. Example 4. The social media influencers battle. Another example can be found in the world of social media influencers. These individuals, whose livelihoods depend on public perception and fan engagement, can experience extreme forms of territorial defense when they feel that their influence is under threat. If an influencer faces criticism, such as negative comments or attacks on their character, they may react in ways that are strikingly similar to the goose's instinctive defense of its territory. For an influencer, their territory is not only their brand and image but also their emotional space. Any criticism or negative comment feels like an intrusion into this protected zone, triggering an emotional response. Like the goose, which may honk and chase after a perceived predator, the influencer might engage in public responses, retaliating against critics or defending their actions in a forceful manner. The need to protect their image and status can lead to a reactive, often emotional outburst, mirroring the territorial behaviors of geese in the wild. Example 5. The parental reaction. Finally, consider the reaction of a parent who is protective of their children. If a parent perceives any threat to their child's safety, whether it's a bully at school or a negative influence, instinctively, they will defend their child's emotional and physical well-being with vigor. Just like a goose defending its nest against an intruder, the parent will take action to shield their child from harm, often without considering the full scope of the situation. The instinct to protect one's offspring is rooted in biology and is fundamental to human survival. Just like the goose's instinctive honk, which warns off potential threats, the parent will react to a perceived danger with strong emotions and defensive actions, motivated by an innate desire to protect their family. This territorial instinct is hardwired into both animals and humans, driving them to safeguard their most cherished relationships and assets. Through these examples, it becomes clear that the territorial instincts we see in geese are mirrored in humans, albeit in more complex and socially nuanced ways. Whether in personal relationships, work environments, or online interactions, our reactions to threats, both physical and emotional, are deeply rooted in our primal survival mechanisms. Just like the goose, humans often react defensively, often without reflection, to preserve their emotional territory. In the next chapter, we will explore the deeper lessons we can learn from understanding these instinctual behaviors and how they can lead to greater self-awareness and emotional growth. As we come to the final chapter of this exploration into the behavior of geese and its parallels to human emotional responses, it's time to reflect on what we can learn from these instinctual behaviors. By understanding how the defense mechanisms of animals, like the goose, are mirrored in our own emotional and psychological responses, we gain valuable insight into our emotional lives, how we interact with others, and, most importantly, how we can grow as individuals. One of the key lessons to take away from this comparison is the importance of self-awareness. Just as the goose reacts instinctively when it feels its territory is threatened, humans too often react to emotional threats without fully understanding the reasons behind those reactions. A sharp comment from a colleague, an argument with a partner, or a disagreement on social media can provoke a defensive response. But in many cases, these responses are more about our own insecurities, past experiences, or fear of losing something important, our status, our peace of mind, or our self-esteem, than about the immediate situation itself. By becoming more aware of our own emotional triggers, we can begin to recognize when we are reacting like the goose, defending our territory out of instinct rather than conscious choice. When we pause and reflect, we can separate our knee-jerk responses from the actual issue at hand. This pause allows us to respond with intention rather than emotion, giving us control over our reactions and ultimately helping us make better decisions in challenging situations. Another important takeaway from the behavior of the goose is the power of emotional regulation. While the goose's instinct to protect its territory is valid in nature, humans have the ability to temper their instincts. Unlike the goose, who might lash out without a second thought, humans have the capacity to regulate their emotions before acting on them. This emotional regulation can be achieved through practices like mindfulness, deep breathing, or simply taking a moment to pause before responding to a perceived threat. Instead of immediately reacting with anger, defensiveness, or aggression, we can create a space between stimulus and response. This space is where emotional control lives. Where we can choose how to react, rather than letting our emotions dictate our behavior. Learning to regulate our emotions not only helps us avoid overreacting in tense situations but also enables us to approach conflicts with a clearer mind and a more compassionate heart. By taking a step back before speaking or acting, we can avoid causing unnecessary harm to others and prevent escalating situations that could have been resolved peacefully. As we've seen with the goose, its defensive reaction is based on the instinct to protect itself and its territory from perceived threats. Similarly, our defensive reactions often stem from deeper, sometimes unconscious fears and insecurities. These fears may not always be obvious on the surface, but they can drive our behavior in ways we don't fully understand. For instance, when we react defensively in a disagreement, we might be trying to protect something deeper within us. Perhaps a fear of failure, rejection, or inadequacy. Understanding the root causes of our emotional responses can help us address the true source of our feelings, rather than simply reacting to the surface-level situation. This self-awareness opens the door to greater emotional healing and growth. When we identify the underlying fears or unmet needs that trigger our defensive reactions, we can begin to work through those issues and address them more effectively. This self-reflection helps us move from reactive to proactive in our emotional lives, empowering us to make choices that align with our values and desires. Boundaries are another crucial concept that arises from the goose's instinctual behavior. Just as geese set clear boundaries to protect their territory, we too need to establish and maintain healthy emotional boundaries in our lives. These boundaries protect us from emotional harm, and they help us preserve our sense of self-worth and dignity in relationships. However, just as the goose's boundary can be overprotective at times, we must ensure that our own boundaries are balanced. Setting boundaries is not about building walls that isolate us from others, rather, it's about creating space that allows us to feel safe, respected, and valued. Healthy boundaries empower us to navigate relationships with confidence, allowing us to assert ourselves without becoming defensive or aggressive. Moreover, setting boundaries doesn't mean we should shut down or disengage from others when conflict arises. It simply means recognizing our own limits and communicating them effectively. Like the goose honking when an intruder approaches, we can assert our needs and protect our emotional space without resorting to destructive behaviors. This kind of communication fosters respect, understanding, and healthy interactions. Finally, one of the most profound lessons we can learn from examining the behavior of geese and their territorial instincts is the importance of compassion, both for ourselves and for others. Geese defend their territories not out of malice but out of instinct and survival. Similarly, when humans react defensively, it is often driven by deep-seated fears, past traumas, or a need to protect something vulnerable. By approaching ourselves and others with compassion, we can soften the harshness of our reactions. Instead of reacting with judgment, we can recognize that behind every defensive outburst is a person who is struggling with their own vulnerabilities. This understanding allows us to respond with empathy, seeking to understand the emotional needs behind the behavior, rather than simply reacting to the surface-level conflict. Furthermore, compassion toward ourselves is key in breaking the cycle of defensiveness. When we are kind to ourselves, acknowledging our fears and emotional triggers without judgment, we allow space for growth and healing. This self-compassion leads to greater resilience, allowing us to face life's challenges with a sense of inner peace, rather than constantly feeling the need to defend our emotional territory. In conclusion, the defensive behavior of geese offers valuable lessons about the human experience. It reminds us of our primal instincts to protect our emotional and psychological territory, but it also highlights the potential for growth and change. By becoming more self-aware, regulating our emotions, understanding the root causes of our defensive reactions, setting healthy boundaries, and practicing compassion, we can transform our responses and foster deeper, more meaningful connections with others. As we reflect on these insights, we are left with a final question to ponder. How can we use our understanding of these primal instincts to break free from automatic reactions and move toward more thoughtful, compassionate responses in our daily lives? As we conclude this journey through the defensive instincts of geese and their striking parallels to human emotional reactions, we are left with an essential reflection. How often do we act out of instinct, without truly understanding why? The geese remind us that our emotions are primal and often triggered by perceived threats, but they also offer us the opportunity to recognize, reflect, and transform our reactions. By embracing self-awareness, emotional regulation, and compassion, we unlock the ability to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. We can choose not to be controlled by our instincts but to evolve beyond them, understanding the deeper currents driving our emotions. So, as you walk away from this exploration, ask yourself, when faced with emotional challenges, will you react as a goose, defending your territory instinctively? Or will you pause, reflect, and choose a more mindful, compassionate response? The choice is yours.